This story is about why you should never assume you truly know someone. You might think you understand them, but in reality, you often have no idea what they're thinking or what they're capable of. It happened about 5 or 6 years ago. Back then, the daily grind was starting to take its toll on both me and my girlfriend Megan. One day, she suggested renting a cabin in the woods so we could relax for a few days. I liked the idea right away, but we didn't have much money. Then she made another suggestion. My best friend Jake and his girlfriend were close friends of ours, so she thought it would be fun to organize a trip for the couples. We could spend time together, and they would cover half the costs. I thought it was a great plan, and Jake agreed as soon as I mentioned it. Since the trip was scheduled for late winter, we wanted a cabin with a fireplace and a cozy atmosphere. Megan found a place we liked, and we booked it for late February. We were all excited and started planning the meals, games, and other things we'd do while we were there. But a week before the trip, Jake and his girlfriend suddenly broke up, and it wasn't an amicable breakup. Megan and I weren't sure what to do. We discussed whether we should offer Jake his money back or leave the subject alone. We really couldn't afford the trip by ourselves, but it also didn't seem right for him to pay for a vacation he wasn't taking. I called him to talk it over, and he told me not to worry about it. I offered more than once to return his share, but he refused every time. He insisted that Megan and I should still go enjoy a romantic weekend together. When I told Megan, she was thrilled, and we started looking forward to having the cabin to ourselves. The next day, a week before our planned departure, Jake called and said he'd found another person to come with us. I wasn't too excited about that idea, and Megan felt the same way. Neither of us wanted to spend a weekend with some rebound girlfriend Jake barely knew himself. I tried explaining that traveling with someone is different from casually hanging out, and we knew absolutely nothing about this woman. Jake kept pushing, and eventually he convinced me. He even offered to pay my entire share of the trip and promised his new girlfriend was cool and that we'd really like her. Megan and I still weren't happy about it. We knew the trip could easily turn awkward, and that alone sounded like a disaster waiting to happen. After thinking it over, though, we decided we'd just make the best of it. When the weekend finally arrived, we all rode to the cabin together in my truck. That's when Jake introduced us to his new girlfriend, Amber. She seemed nice enough and was very quiet. That stood out because Megan and I are the complete opposite. We're outgoing, loud, and sometimes a little annoying. We spent most of the drive trying to get to know Amber, but she barely talked. By the time we arrived, I felt like I'd hardly heard her speak. At first, everything went smoothly. We unpacked, got comfortable, and sat around the fireplace talking. Megan and I love card games, especially Uno. We like how simple it is because you can play it anywhere. Megan suggested a game, and everyone agreed. Even Amber seemed to be relaxing and opening up a little. That's when we saw the first major red flag. During the game, Megan called Uno to let everyone know she only had one card left. Amber immediately looked at her and, in a voice that was usually quiet and timid, started angrily accusing her. At first, we laughed because we thought she was joking. She wasn't. Amber became furious. She started yelling that Megan had to be cheating and that there was no way she could only have one card left. Megan defended herself, but Amber kept screaming and acting like a child throwing a tantrum. And I mean actually screaming. I'm not exaggerating when I say she was yelling over a game while sitting with people she'd barely met. Even if Megan had cheated, which she absolutely hadn't, the reaction was completely unreasonable. When Jake tried calming her down, Amber threw her cards and stormed out of the living room. Jake apologized, and we mostly laughed it off because the whole thing felt ridiculous. Later that night, Megan made dinner, and Amber acted perfectly normal, almost as if the meltdown had never happened. That was red flag number 2. While we ate, Amber started sharing extremely personal details about her relationship with Jake. These weren't things most people would ever discuss in front of others, especially people they just met. Out of respect for Jake, I won't repeat what she said. I could tell he was embarrassed. I kept making jokes and changing the subject whenever I could. Eventually she stopped, and the rest of the evening was pretty uneventful. Sometime during the night, Megan woke me up and told me to listen. I sat up and focused for a moment. That's when I heard Amber and Jake arguing. I couldn't make out exactly what they were saying because their bedroom was on the other side of the cabin and our door was shut. Still, from the tone of their voices and the way they were speaking, it was obvious they were arguing. The whole situation felt incredibly awkward. We didn't want Jake to feel worse than he already did, so Megan and I acted like we hadn't heard anything and agreed not to bring it up the next day. The following morning and most of the day were pretty normal. Jake seemed withdrawn, and we hardly saw Amber at all. Nothing unusual happened until that night. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up and nearly jumped out of my skin when I saw Jake standing over my bed. It scared me to death. I asked him what he was doing and immediately noticed that he looked genuinely terrified.
He asked if he could stay in our room for the night and if we could keep the door locked. Confused, I asked him what was going on. He told me that he'd woken up earlier and found Amber standing at the foot of the bed, staring at him. When he asked what she was doing, she simply shrugged and said she was watching him sleep, just in case. To this day, I have no idea what that was supposed to mean. Jake said they looked at each other for several seconds before she turned around and walked out of the room. Even after several minutes passed, she never came back. Eventually, he got up to check on her and make sure she was okay. That's when he noticed something strange on her side of the bed. He pulled back the blanket slightly and found a large knife lying there. That discovery was enough to send him straight to our room. He quietly made his way through the dark cabin, trying not to make any noise. As he passed through the living room, he saw Amber wandering around while humming to herself and moving almost like she was dancing. He said it looked a little like sleepwalking, except somehow much creepier. When she got close to our bedroom door, the floor let out a slight creak. She immediately stopped humming. Then she turned in his direction and, in a chilling voice, said, "I see you." Jake told me it didn't even seem like she was looking directly at him. She was just facing his general direction. A moment later, she turned away and started humming again while wandering through the dark cabin. That's when Jake slipped into our room and locked the door behind him. I was still trying to process everything he had told me when Megan woke up. Since we were in the middle of nowhere, none of us really knew what to do. It was possible that Amber was experiencing some kind of sleepwalking episode, but the knife didn't fit that explanation. While we talked it over, we could still hear her pacing through the cabin, and about 5 minutes later, we heard the front door slam shut.
We opened the bedroom door and realized that Amber was gone. Jake looked out the window and saw her walking into the frosty forest, wearing nothing but a t-shirt and shorts. He immediately ran to his room and screamed in panic because the knife was missing. Megan insisted that we couldn't just leave her wandering through the woods in the middle of the night, especially if she suffered from sleepwalking. Jake, on the other hand, was scared and didn't want anything to do with his new girlfriend. Megan went back to our room and started putting on warm clothes and a jacket. Jake kept begging her to call the forest ranger or someone else instead. I'd known Jake my whole life, but I'd never seen him so scared before. While we were still discussing what to do, we suddenly heard the cabin door open and then close again. The three of us fell silent immediately and listened. We could hear Amber stomping down the hallway toward the bedroom she shared with Jake, and she was humming the whole time. None of us slept until morning. We stayed in our room and waited for dawn. Around 8 o'clock, we heard Amber washing dishes in the kitchen. When we finally came out, she greeted us as if nothing unusual had happened. Megan and I convinced ourselves that Amber was just a little eccentric, and Jake was perhaps being overly sensitive because of his recent breakup. The events from the night before were definitely strange, but we figured sleepwalking or something similar could explain most of it. Jake wasn't buying that explanation at all. He was convinced something much darker was going on, but Megan dismissed the idea immediately. She went to help Amber clean up, while I stayed behind and tried to reassure Jake. A couple of minutes later, he sent me a message asking me to come to his room immediately and not to tell anyone. I went there right away.
As he was packing his things, he pushed Amber's bag aside. When he set it down on the floor, a large knife fell out of the side pocket. It was the same knife he had found the night before. I saw the fear on Jake's face, and to be honest, I felt it too. He quietly put the knife back in her bag, then sat down in the living room, waiting for everyone to finish getting ready so we could leave. The ride home was incredibly tense. The mere thought that Amber had been carrying that knife was enough to make the entire trip uncomfortable and unsettling. Thankfully, we all made it back home safely and without a scratch. After that trip, Jake completely cut Amber off and never contacted her again. Apparently, she didn't care either, because she never tried reaching out to him. Every now and then, Megan still tries searching for Amber online, but she's never found anything. She's checked social media, public records, and even inmate databases, but there's never been any trace of her. It's almost like Amber never existed at all, which makes us think she was probably using a fake name. If that's true, then what was her goal? Sometimes I wonder whether she intended to hurt Jake. Honestly, I still don't know what to make of that weekend. The combination of the knife and the fact that we can't find any record of her makes me believe she may have had some very dark intentions. Luckily, for whatever reason, she never followed through with them. Over the last several years, I've become pretty disconnected from the rest of the world. I've always preferred being alone and never really enjoyed being around people, except for a small handful of individuals in my life. Back then, I was probably at the peak of my introverted phase. I constantly looked for ways to find peace and quiet. Whenever I could afford it, I'd rent cabins or stay in other secluded places for the weekend, just to get away from everyone.
That might sound extreme to some people, but my anxiety around normal social interactions had gotten so bad that I was willing to go to those lengths simply to be by myself. I kept up that habit for about 2 years. During one of those cabin weekends, something happened that genuinely unsettled me. The trip started like all the others. I found a remote cabin about 2 hours away from home and drove out there for the weekend. Usually, I'd spend my time hiking, enjoying the outdoors, and catching up on books. I've always loved reading, and being surrounded by nature helps me relax and focus. I arrived at the cottage on Saturday evening, made myself a simple dinner, read a few chapters of a book, and went to bed early. The next morning, I decided to go for a long hike. Being outside has always brought me a sense of calm. It doesn't matter if it's sunny, raining, or snowing. I just enjoy being out in nature. While walking through the woods, I started hearing something behind me. It sounded like twigs snapping and branches breaking. Normally, you'd assume it was just wildlife or ordinary forest noise, but there was something about it that felt almost intentional. I'm naturally prone to overthinking, so my mind immediately jumped to the idea that someone might be following me. Every time I turned around and looked, though, I didn't see a single person. I kept hiking for a while, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. My paranoia kept growing stronger. I had planned to go farther, but eventually I turned around and headed back to the cabin. By that point, I wasn't even enjoying the hike anymore. That evening was rough. Maybe it was because of the anxiety I'd felt earlier in the woods, but I remember feeling unusually down. I decided to pour myself a drink. One drink became several. As the alcohol started kicking in, I relaxed a little,
and the anxiety from the hike slowly faded away. I tried getting back to my book, but I couldn't focus. Instead, I put on some music and just sat there, enjoying the evening. That night, around 10 o'clock, I thought I heard someone knocking on the door. I turned off the music and went to check. The front door was a thick wooden one with 2 narrow square windows. I looked outside, but didn't see anyone. Thinking I had imagined it, I walked away. However, before I could sit down, I heard the knocking on the cabin again. I went back to the door and peered through the windows again. This time, someone was standing outside, but it was too dark to make out who it was. Before saying anything, I turned on the porch light. It illuminated most of the person standing there. I was surprised that he didn't look threatening or suspicious at all. In fact, it was just the opposite. A well-dressed man in a suit was standing on the street. About 5 feet 9 inches tall, he had an athletic build and light hair. He looked as though he belonged in a boardroom or at a business meeting, not in the woods late at night. I couldn't understand why a man dressed like that had shown up at a remote cabin at 10 o'clock at night. Through the closed door, I asked if he was all right and what he needed. Before answering, he paused strangely. It seemed almost unnatural, as if he were deliberately taking his time to consider my question before responding. Finally, he spoke. He said that earlier that day he had been driving with his girlfriend. According to him, he had spent several hours wandering around the area trying to find her, and now he was completely lost. He asked if he could come inside and use a phone to call for help. The situation was already unsettling because a complete stranger had shown up at a remote cabin in the middle of the night. But what bothered me most was the way he spoke. He didn't sound scared, worried, or desperate. His voice was completely emotionless. I told him to step away from the door and wait at the end of the driveway while I called someone for assistance. Once again, he paused and slowly looked around. In the same flat tone, he told me he really needed to come inside. He said there was something outside, and if he couldn't get indoors, he was going to be in trouble. The feeling of tension that hit me at that moment is hard to put into words. I told him I was calling the police and that he could either wait outside or leave, but there was no chance I was letting him into the cabin. As I walked away from the door to get my phone, I heard him say that he needed to hide inside. He repeated that he was in trouble and needed somewhere to hide. The second I grabbed my phone, he started pounding on the door. I rushed back and began yelling every curse word I could think of at him. Then, right in the middle of my rant, I stopped. The man was laughing. It was the most emotion he'd shown since he appeared. I looked through the window and nearly jumped out of my skin. His face was pressed right up against the glass, only inches from mine. The sight of him that close almost knocked me backward. In a calm voice, he said, "Come on, Ethan. Just open the door." Somehow, this stranger knew my name. I froze for a moment. Then, instinct took over, and I immediately called the police. I told the dispatcher that I was alone in the cabin and that a stranger was trying to break in. As soon as I finished the call, I looked out the window again. The man was gone. For the next 20 minutes, I waited for the police to arrive, barely taking my eyes off the windows. During that entire time, I didn't see a single movement outside. Finally, a patrol car pulled up. As soon as the officer arrived, I quickly opened the door and let him inside. I told him everything that had happened. He looked both concerned and surprised. He said that none of the neighbors had reported anything suspicious and that he had never received calls like this before. The officer was kind and could see that I was completely distraught. He suggested that if I still felt unsafe, I should go into town and spend the night somewhere else. I explained that I'd been drinking and didn't feel confident driving, but I didn't want to stay in the cabin alone either. To my surprise, he offered to drive me into town himself.
As we walked toward his patrol car, I suddenly heard him make a strange sound, as if something had taken him by surprise. I asked what had happened. He pointed to my car. All 4 tires were flat, and it looked as if someone had slashed them.
At that point, I started coming apart a little. The officer did his best to keep me calm and focused. He drove me to a nearby hotel and even stayed in the lobby with me until I was able to get in touch with my dad. I spent the night there, and the next morning my father came to pick me up and help arrange for my car to be towed. The cabin owner contacted me repeatedly afterward, apologizing over and over. Honestly, I didn't care. I just wanted the whole experience behind me. I never even bothered asking for a refund. Over the years, some people have suggested that the cabin owner was somehow involved, or maybe that he was actually the man in the suit. I don't buy that theory. The owner had a profile picture, and he looked nothing like the man who showed up at my door that night. I never got any answers about what happened, and I'm pretty sure I never will. Even now, thinking about that night gives me chills. To this day, seeing those little prism-style windows in a door makes me uncomfortable. What bothers me most is knowing that somewhere out there, that man could still be terrifying other people. My father passed away 7 months ago. I'm not sharing that because I'm looking for sympathy. The truth is, we never had a particularly good relationship. He wasn't a terrible person. We were just very different, and he never really knew how to be the father I needed. Even when I was young, I understood that I wasn't anything like him. I knew I would never become the person he wanted me to be, and I think that disappointed him, even if he never consciously admitted it. When he died, I was surprised to learn that he had left me his cottage in his will. Some of my friends joked that it was his way of playing one last prank on me, but I don't think that's true. Personally, I believe he knew I would eventually sell it, and that was exactly his intention. After all the legal issues and details regarding the inheritance were settled, I was told that before putting it up for sale, I had to clean it out and do some repairs. I used this as an excuse to spend some last moments in the cabin before saying goodbye to it for good. For me, this trip was really a way of saying goodbye to my father. As soon as I stepped inside the cabin, the first thing that hit me was the smell. It was absolutely awful. The place smelled like something had died in there. And no, before anyone wonders, my dad didn't pass away at the cabin. In fact, he hadn't been there for nearly a year and a half before he died. I searched the room for a dead animal or anything else that might explain the smell, but found nothing. My guess was that the cabin simply stank terribly after years of neglect and lack of proper cleaning. Once I got used to the smell, I noticed something else. The cabin looked exactly the same as it did when I was 12. The furniture was arranged the same way. The old, stained sofas were still in place, the bookshelves hadn't moved, and almost nothing had changed. For the next few hours, I cleaned every inch of the first floor. Fortunately, my father had replaced the roof a few years ago, so that was one of the main problems I didn't have to deal with. As I worked through my list of repairs and cleaning tasks, I kept hearing a noise above me. It sounded like rustling and movement. Then I remembered the attic. To call it an attic would be a gross exaggeration. It was more like a strange combination of an attic and a basement, as if it couldn't decide what exactly it was supposed to be. There's a hallway in the back of the cabin, and in the ceiling of that hallway is a pull cord. When you pull it, a hatch opens and a folding ladder drops down. I slowly climbed up, fully expecting to find raccoons, squirrels, or some other army of animals waiting for me. Instead, I was hit by an even worse smell than the one downstairs. The odor was so strong that I immediately started coughing. When I finally caught my breath and looked around, I was disgusted. Boxes were stacked everywhere, but what really stood out was the amount of trash.
There were food wrappers, empty beer cans, and random garbage scattered all over the place. I knew my dad wasn't exactly a neat person, but I never imagined he was this messy. I picked up some of the trash, but I didn't stay up there very long. Between the smell and the hours I'd already spent cleaning downstairs, I was exhausted. I wasn't ready to sort through all those boxes and deal with the attic that night.
After hauling down a pile of garbage, I decided I'd tackle the upstairs the following day. Not long after that, I went to bed. I put my own clean sheets on my dad's old bed and slept in his room. Sometime during the night, I woke up because I thought I heard that rustling sound again. At first, I figured maybe there were animals living inside the walls. That would explain the noises, and if animals were dying in there too, it could explain the smell. The problem with that theory was that the sounds weren't coming from the walls. They were clearly coming from the attic directly above me. Since I wasn't sleeping well anyway, I decided to get up and investigate. When I walked into the back hallway, I immediately noticed something strange. The attic hatch was open, and the ladder was hanging down. It seemed odd, but I figured maybe I hadn't latched it properly. Maybe the wind had shaken it loose, or maybe an animal had somehow knocked it open. As I stepped closer to close it, I noticed another snack wrapper lying on the floor at the base of the ladder. I couldn't believe there was still more trash. Annoyed, I picked it up, carried it into the kitchen, and threw it away. Then I grabbed a bottle of water, walked into the living room, and sat down on the couch. The room was dark, and I already knew I wasn't falling back asleep anytime soon, so I decided to stay awake for a while. There was a small lamp sitting on an end table beside the couch. I switched it on. The light wasn't very bright. It gave off a dim orange glow, but it was enough. At least I wasn't sitting in complete darkness. As I sat there, my thoughts drifted to my father. Then I started thinking specifically about him spending time in this cabin. I found myself wondering why he would ever choose to sit in that filthy attic when he had the entire cabin available to him.
As dirty as the place was, it was still far more comfortable than that cramped, disgusting attic. While I was sitting there thinking, something caught my eye. In the corner of the room, near the recliner, I noticed what looked like a blanket draped over something. By itself, that wouldn't have been unusual. What bothered me was that I'd spent hours cleaning the downstairs earlier, and I didn't remember seeing any blanket covering anything. Slowly, I stood up and started walking toward it. I stopped dead in my tracks. I was only a few feet away from the blanket when I noticed something sticking out from underneath it. It looked like the bottom of a boot. Slowly, I took a step backward and tried to focus in the dim light. My eyes stayed locked on the blanket. Then I saw it move. The entire blanket shifted, and in that moment, it became obvious that someone was underneath it. The noises I'd been hearing earlier weren't animals at all. I'd been listening to a person moving around inside the cabin. For a few seconds, I just stood there, staring. The longer I looked, the more obvious it became that someone was hiding beneath that blanket. I could even see it rising and falling with each breath the person took. At that point, I had no interest in learning anything else about whoever was under there. I slowly backed away, made my way into the kitchen, grabbed my phone and car keys, and then ran out of the cabin. I sprinted to my car, started the engine, and began backing down the long driveway. As I was pulling away, I looked toward the cabin and saw a frightening-looking man rush out the front door. He didn't come after me or try to stop the car. He simply ran outside and stood there in front of the cabin. I immediately called the local police department and reported everything. The officer I spoke with said that since my father hadn't been living there for quite some time, it was possible that a homeless drifter or some other stranger had moved into the cabin for shelter.
Since nobody had been visiting the property, the man may have simply stayed there. Based on the smell and the condition of the place, the officer guessed that whoever had been living there might have been there for at least a year. That theory made sense because my father hadn't visited the cabin for a long time before he died. Unfortunately, by the time the police arrived, the man had already disappeared. To this day, I have no idea who he was, where he came from, or where he ended up. Personally, I don't think he planned to hurt me, unless he absolutely had to. He had plenty of opportunities, and never made a move.
Still, that doesn't make the situation any less disturbing. The reality is that I'd been sitting in that cabin with a complete stranger who had apparently been living in my father's filthy attic. After that night, I never set foot inside the cabin again. I hired people to clean the place out, and I didn't even bother explaining what had happened. Maybe that makes me a bad person, but I wanted nothing more to do with it. Everything inside was thrown away, and I sold the property exactly as it was. I just hope the people who own that cabin now enjoy it as much as my father did. And more importantly, I hope they never discover an unexpected guest hiding inside.